Best moments reaction. That's your channel, bro?
When they went to the...
This is content nowadays. He just sits there reacting, bro. That's actually you, Tommy? I talk to... Shut up, chat! I'm talking the whole time. I have my own opinion. I react to stuff. I'm sitting here like, let's talk about blah, 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 blah. This is not okay, chat. It's not okay. And I'm calling you out. These people, they sit there like this. Like this is how they make content. Okay. Hey guys, we're gonna react to this real quick. Let's go.
Ever since they completed the highly successful Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives in November, and after failing to take Crimea and Svatova with ease in autumn, the Ukrainian army has mostly been back on the defensive and has been fighting heavy battles in the Bakhmut.
I never react like this. You cut me some slack for once, you motherfucker. No difference, literally you. I wrote it down yesterday. I wrote it down on my notebook. Read chat less. Read chat less.
Avdiivka, Vuhledar, Crimea, Mariinka, Kupiansk, and other sectors of the front. The Ukrainian plan was to withstand the Russian winter offensive with minimal losses, waiting for Western tanks and armored...
Look at this guy. You see why he's VIP? Tommy reacts to 5-minute videos and talks about them for 20 minutes. That's very different. That guy gets it.
...vehicles to arrive on the battlefield, while training new soldiers to launch its counter-offensive.
Oh man, New Year's Eve.
Ukraine has mostly stood its ground, completed the first part of its plan more or less successfully. And as more Western tanks and weapons arrive in Ukraine, the pro-Ukrainian public is becoming restless. When is Ukraine going to counterattack? Where will it
attack?
Are
they getting restless? Are they actually getting restless? Like, is that real? I think the public believes in their army, bro. I don't know if that's...
Are the Ukrainian and Russian armies preparing for this? What are the realistic expectations of this counteroffensive? We will try to answer all of these questions in this video. First of all, the question of timing has been on many people's minds. The Ukrainian officials have been giving very different timelines.
It's very funny how the whole world is thinking, when is this offensive starting? But it's a war. It should be secret, right? If the Russians want to know what Ukraine is doing, just go to YouTube. Brother, what do you think Ukraine doing next? Just check out this YouTuber. Talk about it.
The defense minister, Reznikov, stated on March 29th that the counteroffensive will start in April or May. On April 12th, the Prime Minister, Shmyhal, said that it may start in the summer instead of spring, if more time is needed.
If I was Ukraine, I would just lie so much.
According to the Pentagon leaks, the United States expects the counteroffensive to start on April 30th. On April 6th, Security Council Secretary Danilov said that Ukraine would strike in the coming days or weeks, adding that only 5 people knew all the details about the plan.
One of them,
he later stated that Ukraine will not launch its counteroffensive unprepared, which
I read this morning, Bakhmut is getting encircled. Yeah, they said Bakhmut is getting encircled.
President Zelensky's response to a question about the counteroffensive from late March. We can't start yet. We can't send our brave soldiers to the front line without tanks, artillery, and long-range rockets. So the short answer is, we do not have hard info on when the Ukrainian army will start its counteroffensive. First, Ukraine has to get all the tanks and armored vehicles pledged by the West to have a chance for success.
Where will you attack?
Evidently, they are still waiting
they will
for
never
them.
expect it.
Second, even if Ukraine indeed intended to
if I was a HOI4, right, I will go here. Encircle this and kill them all. Don't kill them, because then, you know, imprison them and shit. But fucking bam bam. It's a war for attrition, man.
Sometime in mid-April, rainy weather, which has caused muddy terrain, has prevented them. Rainy weather will continue until the end of April, which probably means that Ukraine must wait until May. Third, Ukrainian officials may have intentionally made contradictory and misleading statements to maintain some level of surprise for the Russian army, which is very important for the success of an offensive. It is challenging to have the surprise factor in this day and age of satellites, drones, and social media. Still, after all, Ukraine managed to take the Russians by surprise in the Kharkiv counteroffensive, while telegraphing their intent to counterattack in Kherson the whole time.
It's crazy.
How is the Ukrainian army preparing for the counteroffensive?
Fucking crazy.
As expected, there are conflicting reports about the size of the Ukrainian assault force. The Wagner chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, claims that the Ukrainians have 200,000 ready for the counteroffensive. According to the Pentagon leaks, 12 brigades have trained or are being trained specifically for the counteroffensive, 9 of them by NATO allies, with the rest preparing in Ukraine. The Atlantic Council claims that the size of a Ukrainian brigade is usually 4,000 soldiers. So if we trust this information, the Ukrainian assault brigades have at best 48,000 men and women in their ranks. According to Reuters, Ukraine is readying 8 assault units with 40,000 people in its ranks. Such discrepancy between the manpower estimated by Prigozhin and Western sources is probably due to the latter talking only about units which have been created specifically for the counter-offensive, while Prigozhin may include reserves and units which are already fighting. The exact number of tanks and armored vehicles Ukraine will use in the counter-offensive can only be guessed too. Again, according to the Pentagon leaks, 253 tanks are required for the 9 brigades trained in the West.
Oh, they're waiting
Whether
for green
required
equipment like
means that these 9 brigades will get those 253 tanks, or that this is the ideal number.
One thing I was thinking about. So the Wagner group is mercenaries, so they fight for money, right? Why doesn't someone really, really rich from the West, like Elon Musk, just buy Wagner? If I was like a billionaire, like I could buy Twitter for 40 billion, I would call Ukraine and I'm like, hey Zelensky, listen to this. I'm gonna buy Wagner, I'm gonna make them retreat, and then you just take everything, okay? Okay, yeah, like the 9th of April. Yeah. I call Wagner. Hey, suka bled, hey, I pay you triple what Putin is paying you. Okay, 5 times. You good? Okay, see you later. Boop, easy. We should do a fundraiser. We should do a donation stream for that. Just subscribe, yeah. But probably Putin is gonna poison you or some shit, right? You probably
the counter-offensive is unclear. But many speculate that more than 200 tanks and 800 armored vehicles will be used.
Hey, wake the fuck
up!
The
Pentagon leaks show that Ukraine will
money,
not create dedicated tank or mechanized units to use armored and maneuver advantage on a single axis. Instead, it will disperse the available equipment among its assault brigades. Also, according to the leaked documents, as of February 23rd, Ukrainian units that were supposed to be trained by Western countries are far from being fully trained, which is not ideal, but probably a very difficult thing to achieve in a relatively short period of time. Perhaps one of the reasons for the delay of the counter-offensive is the intention to complete the training course for at least some of the assault units. Russia has been preparing for the Ukrainian move for several months by building defensive lines and erecting fortifications.
You gotta attack where
they have seemingly formidable defensive lines along the Svetova-Crimea line.
Super HOI4. It is Super HOI4, chat. You don't attack where he has river buffs. You don't attack where he has level 10 forts. You attack where you have the biggest mathematical stats, right?
Back in October 2022, Wagner started building a defensive line, stretching from Svitlodarsk to Crimea, and from Crimea to the north of the city of Luhansk. But it is unlikely that the construction has been completed. Fortifications to the north and west of Donetsk have been there since 2014. Most recently, satellite images showed extensive defensive work completed in the northern portion of the Zaporizhia Oblast. According to British intelligence, Russia has built 3 layers of...
I see a weakness. I see it right there. TommyKay, the Mega General. You take all your tanks, you push in this, man. Then you take this massive road, and you fucking... chaos. You unleash chaos, man. You just Heinz Guderian, schneller Heinz, bam, German style, bam, right here, man.
Defensive lines and structures along 120 kilometers.
I didn't see Oppenheimer trailer. That's
satellite images demonstrate that the fortifications in the Zaporizhia Oblast are the most formidable, as the Russian command expects the Ukrainian army to counterattack there. While not all areas have several layers of defensive structures, in the most defended areas, Russian defensive lines consist of extensive minefields, followed by anti-tank structures, such as revettes, and then several lines of pyramid-shaped dragon teeth. Then comes another minefield. If the attacking side manages to pass through that, they will have to face Russian soldiers in dugouts and trenches.
No air, so true.
According to the Soviet and the now Russian military defensive doctrine, the first defensive lines have to be manned by the least skilled units, in this case the mobilized. Elite soldiers, tanks and armored vehicles are supposedly in the secondary or the tertiary defensive lines. On paper, and according to the army manuals, the idea is to let the least skilled units absorb the brunt of the assault force. If they manage to repel them, great. If not, it is not a tragedy. First, losing the least skilled soldiers is less costly. Second, it may become a trap for the adversary. The enemy would try to exploit the breakthrough and advance through the breached line, meeting the elite Russian forces ready to envelop and destroy the enemy. How much of that the modern Russian army can do in practice is unclear, as most elite units have been fighting bloody battles around Bakhmut, Kreminna, Avdiivka and Vuhledar for months. Russia has also been building defensive structures in Crimea, focusing on the Crimean Isthmus as a precaution against a rapid advance in case of the collapse of the initial defensive lines, and the western shore of the peninsula to safeguard against an amphibious assault.
The way you beat stuff like this in HOI4,
the most scattered and presumably weaker fortifications in the Russian defense are along the left bank of the Dnipro.
The tanks have to clean it.
We can assume here that Russia is relying on the Dnipro as a natural defensive barrier, as satellite images show that they have erected the most formidable defensive structures in the Russian-occupied portion of the city of Kherson, in Novokakova and in Pervomayivka, areas which are presumably more suitable for an amphibious assault and deployment. While overcoming defensive structures is by no means impossible, it will require a great degree of coordination and attention to detail by Ukrainian assault brigades.
Really show skill now,
Ukrainian artillery and
aviation. The problem is that Russia will
probably...
I already heard that. There's this one guy who always speaks for the Kremlin. He looks like a guy from the 80s, like a football trainer. And he said, we have reached our wanted goals in Ukraine. Like, they're already setting themselves up. We're taking Donbass and Luhansk, and that's all we ever wanted, guys.
Initially attack the Russian defensive lines to destroy as many fortifications and dragon teeth as possible, and put pressure on their artillery to prevent them from focusing on Ukrainian advanced units. HIMARS would probably be actively used to destroy as many Russian artillery systems and MLRS as possible before the assault. Ukraine can also deploy UAVs carrying grenades to suppress the fire of the Russian infantry's first line and detect Russian firing points. This would have to be followed by demining activities. Ukraine can use M58 Miklik systems, which the United States has already delivered for this purpose. After breaching the minefield, Ukrainian tanks would presumably drive forward, offering coverage to their infantry. The Ukrainian units would have to repeat the same process by breaching another minefield and using their combat engineering equipment to negate the impacts of revetments. The crucial part of the initial Ukrainian attempt to breach the defensive lines would be suppressing the Russian artillery at firing points closer to the front line to avoid costly losses. Ukrainian artillery, air force, ground units and engineering units would have to work in unison to break through the Russian defenses, which is no easy task. Now let's look at the potential targets of the Ukrainian counter-offensive. There are several options, some more realistic, some less, but let's consider all of them. In his March video about future targets of the Ukrainian counter-offensive, Prigozhin suggested that Ukraine may attack Belgorod. It is indicative that Russia has created some defensive fortifications in Belgorod Oblast, while also putting minefield warnings 17 kilometers from the border. There is an argument that Ukraine may attack bordering regions of Russia, as Russia would least expect it, and also because Ukraine may use it as a bargaining chip in post-war negotiations about the future of Ukraine. But it is extremely unlikely. If the Ukrainian army invades the internationally recognized territories of Russia, it may mobilize ordinary Russians to see this war as their own. Most Russians support the war, but are not heavily invested in it. They want Russia to win, but do not want to get involved or enlisted.
Yeah, these idiots, man.
Ukraine probably wants to keep it that way.
Yeah.
Thus,
Ukraine
invading Russian territory would not be prudent.
Russians to
Furthermore, Western allies would not be happy with this
Ukraine
step,
has to tread
as
so
it would
lightly.
further escalate the war. Therefore, we can safely assume that Ukraine will not attack Belgorod.
It's like you have a fight in a schoolyard, right? So there's this kid, right? There's this kid on the schoolyard, like little Bokuin, little Bo, right? And he talks always shit. He's like, fuck you, man. I'll give me your fucking bread, bitch. Give me your dollars. What the fuck? And you're like, whoa, he's bullying me, man. But you know that if you punch him in the face, Bokuin is calling ISP. ISP is coming, 2 meters tall, hipster Turk. He's just gonna slap you. He's gonna eradicate you, man. So you gotta be careful how you handle Bokuin, right? You gotta always be a bit... like nobody sees it, right? And then Bokuin has no proof and shit. You gotta be fucking careful. That's what Ukraine has to do here.
The North Luhansk front seems like a logical point of attack for the Ukrainian counter-offensive. Back in late 2022, this front seemed like the most promising area for Ukrainian attacks. After all, this is where the Ukrainian army had its most successful counter-offensive campaign, liberating large swaths of territories before being halted at the Svatovo-Kreminna line. Russia has been trying to advance on this front, but they have mostly failed.
5 million fucking subs.
If Ukraine chooses to give it another try on the North Luhansk front, the targets of their offensive would be the same: they would look to liberate Svetova on the intersection of the P07 and P66 highways, and then advance on Starobilsk on the intersection of the P07, H21 and T1302 highways. If Ukraine succeeds,
for the first time
Russia will face massive logistical problems.
You know what I mean? They have already
it
attacked,
would
but
lose
now they
shorter
are
supply
attacking
routes to
into big
Donbass,
defenses.
and would have to use a longer route through the P22 highway instead. This may put the Russian control over areas north of the city of Luhansk, including Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, in doubt. A successful counteroffensive on this axis would bring Ukraine closer to Luhansk, the critical component of Russian logistics in Ukraine. Satellite images show that numerous Russian military bases, warehouses housing military vehicles, ammunition and oil depots are located in and around Luhansk. Bringing the lines closer to Luhansk means bringing it into range of HIMARS. But succeeding on this front will be difficult. Russia has built fortifications on the Svetova-Kreminna line and has brought many reserves since the start of the partial mobilization. Another difficulty associated with attacking on this axis is the relative elevation east of the P66 highway, which is a natural defensive advantage.
That's not good.
Can Ukraine counterattack
You gotta go
the city
for
of Donetsk?
that southern.
Prigozhin certainly
You gotta go for that
so.
southern railway. I would
He
think.
warned about the vulnerable flanks of the Russian assault force in Bakhmut, and since then, the Russian command has deployed airborne units to this section. According to Prigozhin, Ukraine has an 80,000-strong force in Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, Drushkivka, Slovyansk, and other nearby towns, and they may choose to strike on the flanks of Bakhmut and advance towards their rear to trap Wagner and other Russian groups in the Bakhmut section.
Make them suffer, man.
Prigozhin argued that if Ukraine succeeds, they would then turn towards Donetsk or drive towards the border to dissect the Russian forces into two. But that is a complex region to conduct offensive operations, which is evident by the slow pace of Russian advance. Even though many buildings in the combat zone of Donbass have been destroyed, this region is still like an endless succession of towns, villages, and industrial complexes, which is highly advantageous for the defending side. Urban combat is the most complex form of warfare
a very, very
for the
big
attacking
task
side,
for Ukraine,
and it is unlikely that Ukraine will choose this risky path. Fortifications built by separatists and the Russian army since 2014 are going to be a problem too. What about the Zaporizhia Oblast? Most military commentators expect the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
Military commentators, they mean the people on Reddit.
If the Ukrainian army liberates Melitopol, they will effectively cut the Russian troops in Crimea and on the left bank of the Dnipro from the rest of the army.
I will go for this region.
The heavily damaged Kerch bridge would remain the sole supply line for thousands of Russian soldiers.
Yet, man?
Ukraine may conduct probing attacks on the line between Kamyanska and Huliaipole and choose the least defended area as their axis of assault. Their targets would probably be Tokmak and then Melitopol, two strategic towns on the intersections of highways. The Zaporizhia Oblast is a steppe area with limited tree line, an advantage for the defensive side. On the other hand, if the Ukrainian army catches momentum, open fields and relatively good road infrastructure would allow for the rapid advance of Ukrainian tanks and armored units.
Thank you for helping the
This section also lacks rivers and much elevation on the way to Tokmak and Melitopol, which is a plus for the offensive side. The only notable river in this section is the river Molochna, but the flow of the river is parallel to the advance, and the Ukrainians would not have to cross it to continue advancing. Satellite images indicate that the Russians have created defensive structures along the Vasilivka-Polohi line, which would be the first big test for the Ukrainian army if they decide to strike
see where they're weakest.
Almost immediately, they would have to face another fortified line of Novobelizerka-Kinsky Razdori.
And then you show some German engineering to these Russians,
Russia also erected fortifications around Mikhailivka, Tokmak, and Ocheretovata, which means they expect the Ukrainians to siege these towns. But the Ukrainians may bypass these towns and move on to Melitopol without capturing them. Satellite images suggest that beyond the Novobelizerka-Kinsky Razdori, Russia has not built a continuous defensive line, instead choosing to fortify separate towns and settlements. If Ukraine breaks through this line, its path to Melitopol may be generally unimpeded. Of course, it is easier said than done.
There we go, kings and generals, man. He just told Zelensky what to do.
Two defensive lines and simultaneously fighting thousands of people. The Ukrainian units on the right bank of the Dnipro would have to fix the Russian units along the river to prevent them from deploying reinforcements from there to the Zaporizhia Oblast. If the Ukrainians succeeded in the Zaporizhia Oblast, They may even consider
cut them all
conducting
off.
a secondary
Cut that all off. Heinz, Guderian, Blitzkrieg, tanks go over here, cut it all off, encircle all of this, man. Like in most multiplayer games, you encircle that shit.
Offensive across the Dnipro.
That's what happens in every multiplayer game,
the Russian
much,
military
right?
commentator Ian Matveev certainly thinks so. He argues that the main goal of the Ukrainian units on the left bank of the Dnipro would be faint attempts to deploy on the right bank. This would force the Russian command to commit to the defense of the left bank of the river and even possibly send reinforcements there. Recently, there have been several reports about Ukrainian special forces actively encroaching on Russian positions on the islands of the Dnipro. Some Russian military bloggers believe that the Ukrainian army is planning operations to cross the river and attempting to create a bridgehead on the left bank. They argue that the recent American supply of military motorboats and calls of the Ukrainian army for local volunteers to provide them with life jackets demonstrate this. They claim that Ukraine has been deploying new units to the right bank and repairing bridges to simplify logistics in preparation for an assault. A successful attack from the Zaporizhia Oblast, paired with a successful deployment to the left bank of the Dnipro, may doom the Russian forces in the Kherson Oblast-Zaporizhia Oblast area and make the Russians' control over Crimea extremely problematic. At this point, we can only speculate. We're not sure about the launch date of the counteroffensive, which makes sense, because why should anyone outside of the Ukrainian political and military leadership be aware of this? But we can safely assume that Ukraine will be waiting for all pledged Western tanks to arrive and for the soil to solidify before they can strike. We do not know where the Ukrainian army will strike. Still, one can argue that they will probably launch several probing attacks on different sections and conduct extensive surveillance before deciding on the main axis of the counteroffensive. Perhaps the most important thing at this point is to lower expectations. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Kuleba, rightly noted that it is dangerous to consider the upcoming spring offensive of the Ukrainian army as the decisive moment of the war. Ukraine may have a resounding success, or it may have a moderate advance, or may fail to make any gains at all in this counteroffensive. All of that is possible to varying degrees of probability, but expecting this turn of the Ukrainian army to try to catch the momentum in the war as the decisive moment and the final blow on the Russian army is wrong. The Ukrainian government and army will certainly...
And that's the point, once again, Tommykay's advice here for Ukrainians. This is a war where time is on Ukraine's side. Russia is getting more and more destabilized. They're all fucking retarded. So what you want to do in this offensive is, you don't want to go all in. You don't want to put everything to one basket. You probe, you get some encirclements, you get some damage done, man. You get some moral victories, and you chip away the moral of these Russians, which is already very, very low.
Hoping that this is not the expectation that their Western allies have from the counteroffensive. Ukraine will most certainly need more military and financial assistance, even beyond the counteroffensive. More videos on this topic are on the way, so make
Okie dokie, well, let's check out Crimea myself, boys. Wait, he's playing with what? What are you still doing here, mate? Jeez. Well, if you want to see more, click these videos. Have fun. Looking good, boy.